panelists that we're excited to introduce. Hi, my name's Max Schmidt. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Environmental Justice Foundation. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. You're expecting probably to see Steve Trent, our CEO and founder, but unfortunately, he's not able to make it today. He has an unforeseen, unavoidable family issue, and he sends his sincere apologies. So I'll be stepping in to moderate. I'm going to first briefly introduce EJF, and I'll give an overview of the topic of this webinar, and then I'm going to hand over to a really excellent and exciting panel of speakers that we're delighted to have. EJF, we're an international NGO that works across 16 countries in 4 continents. Our work exists in the space where environmental degradation, crimes, and unsustainable use of natural resources intersect with and drive human rights abuses. We view environmental justice in the context of the basic human right to a secure and natural environment, explicitly acknowledging that our natural world frames and provides for every single one of the basic needs that we all depend on. For over 2 decades, a key focus of this work has been the nexus of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing and human rights abuses. These issues are closely linked. As marine ecosystems decline due to overfishing, unscrupulous operators are incentivized to engage in illegal fishing to increase their income, as well as human rights abuses to cut their largest controllable cost, which is labor. These practices allow operators to remain artificially profitable in collapsing fisheries that would otherwise be left to recover, fueling what we call a vicious downward cycle. This harms not only the environment and those working on the vessels, but it also harms the legitimate fishers who follow the rules, as well as coastal communities, particularly in the global south, who depend on seafood for food security and livelihoods. EJF's work on this issue combines methodical research with field investigations at sea and on land. The topic of this webinar is a report and film drawing on such investigations, in this case, into the Chinese distant water fleet in the Southwest Indian Ocean. Over the past decade, EJF has examined many of the world's main distant water fishing fleets, exposing extensive human rights abuses and providing recommendations on how to end them, in particular the need to increase transparency in fisheries governance at both the national and global levels. The People's Republic of China flags a distant water fleet that is by far the world's largest, operating across all of the world's major oceans. It has also been widely linked to systemic illegal fishing and associated abuses, not only by EJF, but by a range of NGOs, governments, and the recent work of the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ian Urbina. It is therefore important that scrutiny remains on this fleet to inform and drive much-needed reforms. The Southwest Indian Ocean is a region of almost unparalleled marine biodiversity, where millions of coastal dwellers rely on the ocean for their food security and their livelihoods. So today, we're going to go over the findings of our report through a brief film and a presentation from my colleague, Dr. Callum Nolan. We are then pleased to be joined by an esteemed lineup of speakers looking at different aspects of this issue from a diverse range of perspectives. This includes Deputy Assistant Secretary Malet Mesfin from the US State Department, Dr. Cliff Mboya, an Africa-China analyst and journalist, Dr. Tabitha Mallory from the China Ocean Institute, Maria Valles, who's coordinator of the Southern African Development Community's Regional Monitoring, Control, and Surveillance Coordination Center, and finally, but certainly not last, His Excellency Hobart Mahatante, Madagascar's Minister of Fisheries and Blue Economy. So I think you'd all agree, a fantastic lineup and one that we're very appreciative to have. But first, we're going to start with a brief film, which my colleague will now start.
The Chinese distant water fishing fleet is the largest in the world, with thousands of vessels operating across every ocean, catching millions of tons of fish every year. And it's become notorious in recent decades for widespread illegal fishing practices and severe human rights violations, with hundreds of Chinese vessels implicated in multiple regions across the world. Among the affected areas is the Southwest Indian Ocean, a biodiversity hotspot that's home to thousands of unique marine species and which supports millions of people who rely on the sea for food and income. For years, Chinese and local governments have promoted the socio-economic benefits of embracing Chinese investment in the region's fishing sector proclaiming a zero-tolerance approach to illegal fishing. But instead of the promised prosperity and development, an investigation by the Environmental Justice Foundation has revealed human rights abuses and ecological harm on an industrial scale.
Saji sampai bahkan 4 saji dibunuh. Ya kan diambil giginya aja. Itu untuk kaptennya sendiri sih, dijual ke, kan ada bisnis sama kapal temennya itu.
Ini kan daerah operasi mancing di sana juga populasi hiu cukup banyak.
Iya.
Atau misalnya kapal emas ini masih menangkap ikan hiu masih sebagai tangkapan?
Banyak ya jenis hiunya kan yang masuk ke situ. Kalau nggak ada ikan tuna, ada hiunya semua. Siripnya doang, badannya dibuang. Kayak gitu operasinya sih. Semuanya kayak gitu.
Bahkan lumba-lumba pernah dapat 2. Lumba-lumba dibunuh.
Liwak lumba-lumba. Iya.
Pas posisi si kaptennya itu lagi nih kesel, ikan nggak dapet kan.
Terkadang kerjanya ada yang 18 jam, kadang 19 jam. Ikan banyak, kadang 22 jam nyampe. Oh, kalau ini pertama kali saya kerja gulung-gulung nilon. Ini nggak pakai sarung tangan.
Kenapa nggak pakai sarung tangan?
Soalnya kan nggak dibolehin sama mandornya, harus tangan kosong katanya.
Tiga kali sini sakit dan kaget cuman kaget.
Kita di tengah laut terus itu. Ada salah satu ABK minta pulang sama kapten tuh, minta pulang, terus nggak boleh. Satu udah nggak tahan, mungkin karena ada pengaruh. Sekitar 3 minggu itu dia itu, selama itu tuh dia tuh. Dilihatlah CCTV itu, dicari sekitar kejadian sekitar jam berapa. Di sekitar jam 6.20 kalau nggak salah tuh dia terjunnya itu.
For generations, coastal communities in Southwest Indian Ocean nations have depended on the sea. But the environmental and human toll of the Chinese distant water fleet in their waters now poses a serious threat to the blue economy here. To ensure that the region's fragile marine ecosystems are preserved and that human rights on board distant water fishing vessels are respected, the Chinese government must act now to enforce its own laws and introduce critical transparency measures to eradicate these systemic abuses across its fleet. Southwest Indian Ocean nations should also adopt increased transparency and sustainability measures to protect their waters and the people who depend on them.
And to give some more insights on the report, building on that film, I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Dr. Callum Nolan. Callum is a senior researcher here at EJF, and across his 5 years with us, Callum's worked on a diverse range of investigations and research projects into both illegal fishing and human rights abuses. Prior to joining us, he completed his doctorate at the University of Reading with a research focus on coastal livelihoods in Ghana. Callum, over to you.
Thanks, Max. So yeah, this report is a culmination of a 6-month investigation into the presence and activity of the Chinese distant water fleet in the Southwest Indian Ocean. As Max mentioned, it builds on our existing body of work that explores human rights abuses and illegal fishing in the onboard distant water fishing vessels. So much of the data acquired for this report stems from both on the ground and at sea investigations across 4 countries, which are namely Tanzania, Mozambique, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So through this investigation, we were able to gather high quality video and photographic imagery of Chinese vessels operating, as well as conduct interviews with crew that had worked on board the fleet whilst in the Southwest Indian Ocean. We also conducted extensive desk-based research, which included the analysis of satellite imagery and satellite vessel tracking through platforms such as Starboard and Global Fishing Watch. So this enabled us to paint an accurate description of where vessels are operating, who they interact with, which ports they use, and which markets their seafood is potentially entering. So the findings of the report show that illegal fishing and human rights abuses are widespread on Chinese vessels in the region. In total, we found that Chinese vessels were associated with 177 offences of either illegal fishing or human rights abuses between 2017 and 2023. Many of the vessels found to have been linked to offences remain in the region. For example, nearly half of all longliners that we believe to be authorised in 2023 in the Southwest Indian Ocean are linked to illegalities and abuse. So in total, we interviewed 44 crew that had worked on board Chinese tuna vessels, predominantly from Indonesia and the Philippines. As you can see from this slide, that it was found that illegal fishing and human rights abuses were systemic across the fleet. The crew that we interviewed told us that they were attacked with weapons, that they were forced to work for 22 hours without break, and many of them were victims of debt bondage. So they were having their wages deducted by unscrupulous crew and recruitment agencies. We also conducted interviews with 16 fishers in Mozambique who had worked on board Chinese-owned trawlers in the country, and they similarly painted a very bleak picture of their experience whilst on board, again, as you can see here. When interviewed, crew described being spat at, assaulted, and verbally abused. Our analysis suggests that seafood linked to high-risk vessels in the region is potentially entering key markets, which includes the EU, Japan, South Korea, and the US. This poses a major concern for the legality and the sustainability of the fish on many of our plates. So the report also looked to better understand the political and economic influence of China in the Southwest Indian Ocean region. So both China and local governments have highlighted that the blue economy is a key area of investment and partnership between the two. And significant amounts of Chinese money have been spent on fisheries and port infrastructure in the region in recent years. So these investments are predominantly couched by China in terms of sustainable development, win-win, and shared prosperity. However, the findings of this report directly contradict this narrative, as well as China's stated zero-tolerance approach to IUU fishing. In light of this, I think it poses challenging questions as to how coastal countries can reconcile investment from China into their fishery sectors and with the need for a sustainable, legal, and ethical blue economy. So on that note, I'll pass back to Max, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Callum. I'm now very pleased to introduce our first external speaker, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Ocean, Fisheries and Pole Affairs, Mallet Mesfin, PhD. She currently oversees the formulation and implementation of US policy on a broad range of international issues concerning the ocean, the Arctic, the Antarctic, and marine conservation in the Department of State's Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. Today, Deputy Assistant Secretary Mesfin will be presenting on the importance of addressing IUU fishing and labor abuses in the fishing industry, giving a US perspective and setting out actions. We're absolutely delighted to have you, Deputy Assistant Secretary. I'll hand over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Max, for that introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here today. Can you hear? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Thank you for that introduction and for the invitation to join you today and be a part of this conversation. Combating IUU fishing is really a top priority for the United States, as evidenced by President Biden's National Security Memorandum on IUU fishing and our National 5-Year Strategy for Combating Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing, both of which were released in 2022. As Secretary Blinken has also said, the United States is committed to combating illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing globally, and will continue to support coastal countries and their communities in confronting IUU fishing. These issues are a priority because we know that when left unchecked, IUU fishing damages our ecosystems. It undermines maritime, economic, and food security. It endangers the law-abiding fishers and communities that rely on fish. And all too often, IUU fishing is coupled with criminal activities like drug trafficking and labor rights abuses. So we in the United States are working to combat IUU fishing around the world through a variety of different tools, whether that's our diplomatic outreach, law enforcement partnerships, information sharing, or international capacity building activities. We do this in bilateral and in multilateral fora. At the Department of State, we're working to build stronger rules and standards for international fisheries, and we engage with the world's flag coastal, port, and market states to promote responsibility and accountability. I just wanted to highlight a few examples of this work. The United States leads efforts within regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs, to establish science-based rules for international fisheries and advance effective joint monitoring, control, and surveillance. We promote the Port State Measures Agreement, which now covers over 100 countries and territories. And it's the first and only binding treaty that is aimed at ensuring only legally caught seafood products enter the global market. The United States works to advance negotiations at the WTO to eliminate harmful subsidies that create economic incentives for IUU fishing or contribute to the overall problem of overfishing and overcapacity. And we employ a multifaceted approach to counter illicit transnational maritime activity, including IUU fishing, through the negotiation and implementation of bilateral maritime law enforcement agreements with partner nations. One key element of these agreements is the shipwrighter provision, which allows for another country's law enforcement officials to be deployed aboard U.S. Coast Guard cutters. So we have these tools, and having them in place is one thing, but we also seek to empower officials to use them in the fight against IUU fishing. For example, since September 2022, we've been supporting efforts in Southern Africa through work the Southern African Development Community, or SADC, Atlantic Project has been training more than 250 national officials in Namibia and South Africa to improve their capacity to develop procedures, apply tools, and exchange information with other countries. This project has grown to now include Angola and has resulted in fishery officials disrupting the operations of foreign fishing vessels suspected of IUU fishing, including 20 from the PRC. I do want to take a moment and congratulate Mozambique and the SADC region for the start of construction earlier this week on a new regional fisheries monitoring, control, and surveillance coordination center, which will be based in Maputo. And we look forward to learning more about this initiative, which the SADC Atlantic Project is helping to support as well. So, moving on from IUU fishing to another critical issue that was described in EJF's report is labor abuses. There really is a growing body of evidence that documents severe and human rights abuses in the seafood sector, including forced labor and dangerous conditions on board vessels and in seafood processing. I think the video that we saw was a real visual demonstration of some of those issues. The International Labor Organization estimates that 128,000 fishers are trapped in forced labor worldwide. These abuses can be associated with IUU fishing, where operators often seek to increase profits by disregarding laws around conservation, vessel safety, pollution, and importantly, labor rights. Unfortunately, these abuses often go undisclosed and unaddressed due to many factors. That includes the dispersed nature of the workforce, gaps in enforcement, inconsistent legal frameworks in transnational fishing, workers' isolation at sea, language barriers, and workers' lack of collective power and voice. And the United States government is committed to combating forced labor and advancing respect for workers' rights and decent work in the global seafood supply chain. We are strengthening the implementation and enforcement of measures to promote legal and safe working conditions aboard fishing vessels. Through work of the Maritime Security and Enforcement Act Interagency Working Group, which the State Department co-chairs with NOAA and the Coast Guard, we are committed to employing a whole of government approach to promoting respect for labor rights in the fishing industry and addressing human and labor rights abuses associated with IUU fishing. So when we're looking at these issues, it's really important to acknowledge that both IUU fishing and labor abuses issues are global problems, and they're not specific to any fleet or country. From the US perspective, all flag states must meet their obligations to combat IUU fishing and labor abuses within their fleets, both foreign and domestic. And while these are global problems, I'll turn to the focus of the report today, the PRC fleet. We know that numerous cases of IUU fishing by the PRC's fishing fleet have been documented all over the world, especially because it has the world's largest distant water fishing fleet. These issues are particularly salient in Africa, where IUU fishing represents a persistent and grave threat to the lives and livelihoods of people on the planet. These threats go beyond fisheries to touch on other key US priorities, which include food security, economic development, anti-corruption efforts, and human rights. Weak legal frameworks and low maritime domain awareness, which are challenged by limited government resources and vast coastlines on the continent. This can enable IUU fishing and its associated illicit activities, including forced labor in the region. So the report from EJF offers some new and critical insights into both IUU fishing and labor conditions aboard the PRC's fleet in the Southwest Indian Ocean. The report gives voice to over 800 fishers who were interviewed as a part of the project and helps to provide a really hard to reach perspective on this important issue. EJF has long exposed human rights and labor rights concerns in the fishing industry, and their groundbreaking work over the years has really pushed many stakeholders, including the US government, to work harder to prevent and address forced labor in fishing. One of the things that makes this recent report unique is that it really exposes a say-do gap. There's a gap in the messaging between win-win or blue economy engagement, or even claimed zero tolerance approach to fishing. There's a gap between that messaging and the official subsidies for and the tolerance of malign activity by the PRC. And this report really helps to make some of that clear. So the role that EJF and other NGOs are bringing light to these issues is really essential. And so we thank you for producing this important report and providing your recommendations for all of us to consider in addressing it. I do want to take a moment as well to add a few thoughts on the Global Charter for Fisheries Transparency that EJF has helped to spur and launch. And because the United States is really proud to have supported the Charter's launch at our Ocean Conference in Panama last year. It's really the type of transparency and data sharing that the Global Charter describes really is essential to understanding the full complexity of IUU fishing wherever it occurs. We champion efforts to increase transparency in several RFMOs and in multilateral efforts such as the Port State Measures Agreement, as mentioned before, the Global Record, the FAO voluntary guidelines. Governments and civil society really must continue to build the energy, the cooperation, and the action that we need to ensure that these agreements and the initiatives can build a more transparent and sustainable global fishing industry. And so thanks one more time to EJF for your ongoing work on the report and everything that you do where you're having a real impact in this space. And so thank you for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to the rest of this morning's discussion.
Thank you so much, Deputy Assistant Secretary. Very interesting presentation. A huge array of work that your team is undertaking, and thank you also for noting the importance of transparency and the connection to this issue. I think that's critical. It can't be said enough. While we have you, I've got a few questions. I'd be interested to get your perspective on. Firstly, obviously in the role of the State Department, international coordination is key. And key to combating IUU fishing. What is the role of the State Department in this, and how are the State Department working with other U.S. agencies on them?
Thank you. Yeah, we, in general, the department, we lead on the global efforts to fight IUU fishing and really help to level the playing field for U.S. fishers through, negotiation of international agreements. This started in 2001 with the UN FAO International Plan of Action to prevent, deter, and eliminate IUU fishing. And so we have a critical role there. Our embassies are all over the world and really fundamental to the work that we do here in DC. They are on the ground, working with governments, partners in the field, helping to really spur some of these various bilateral and regional efforts. So point to that for the role of the State Department. In terms of interagency coordination, it's a key part of what we do. We work with partners like NOAA, Coast Guard, the USTR, Department of Defense, and the like-minded governments that we have around the world to put in place these international agreements and to build the partnerships that are needed to combat IUU fishing. As one example, with NOAA, we've driven the development of schemes in RFMOs that help to identify and penalize IUU fishing vessels, to limit port and market access by countries that fail to curb IUU fishing, and really help to provide some coordinated fisheries monitoring, control, surveillance. I mentioned it, we have the Maritime Security and Fisheries Enforcement Act was passed in 2019, and it's really spurred kind of this coordinated whole of government approach, in particular around priority regions and priority flag states. We use the tools that I described before and have an interagency working group that's comprised of 21 federal agencies that all have a role in relevant counter IUU fishing authorities that can be brought to bear to these issues, and again, a whole of government approach. And just in general, we continue to seek and try to identify further ways to enhance international cooperation, in addition to increasing the ambition and the momentum in this fight around these issues. It's one of the reasons we worked with Canada and the United Kingdom in 2022 to help launch an IUU Fishing Action Alliance. The idea is that members of this Action Alliance have a pledge to take urgent action. They sign on to a pledge to take urgent action to improve monitoring, control, surveillance of fisheries, increase transparency, and build new partnerships. So the international coordination piece is so critical and important to this, and we continue to identify the various ways we can continue to spur action globally around these issues.
Thank you. Thank you. And building on that, how can we support and improve monitoring of IUU fishing, particularly in those countries with lower levels of resources to monitor IUU fishing in their national waters, but also on the high seas?
Yeah, I mean, monitoring is really an issue that is consistently at the top of the list of things that we need to work on. I would point to maybe 3 specific areas where we are doing work, just generally collaboration across sectors, across borders, bringing together civil society, philanthropies, local communities, fisheries. It's really through sort of this collaboration where we can get to more effective and efficient means of monitoring and control. So I just point to that up front. But I think there's also really great promise in new technologies, in better data, in improved information sharing in the maritime environment. New technologies are really key to empowering law enforcement to watch for suspicious behavior, things like transshipment, refueling, illegal entry into protected areas. And these technologies are actually highlighted in the report that you guys released as well. One example I'd point to is Sea Vision, which was created by the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's a web-based maritime situational awareness tool that helps to enable users to view and share a really broad array of maritime information, and also help to build partnerships within the maritime community. And so the trends that we're seeing around technology is really, I think, something quite positive. And then I just point to the third thing. One more thing that I mentioned briefly before is shipwriter agreements. You know, these agreements allow coastal state law enforcement personnel to travel aboard U.S. Coast Guard vessels to patrol that coastal state sovereign waters and exercise authority under the country's domestic laws and regulations. So these shipwriters not only allow the U.S. Coast Guard to support countries that may have more limited enforcement resources, but also help to facilitate information sharing, intelligence, maritime domain awareness, and really offer capacity building opportunities that allow coastal state officers to gain experience and at sea operations. So we have 18 bilateral agreements that include fisheries enforcements. We are expanding those agreements. In just the last 12 months, we've signed agreements with Ecuador, Papua New Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. And all the agreements that have been negotiated after 2016 include counter-IUU fishing enforcement authorities. So, these are some key tools and approaches, but, this really is a true need for us to continue to figure out how we are working on the monitoring challenge as well as the enforcement as well.
Thank you so much. It's an impressive array of work that's being done in this area, and it's great to hear your leadership on this. So we greatly appreciate the time that you've spent with us today. We'll now go to our next speaker, though, because we still have 4 really interesting perspectives to get to. The next one being Dr. Cliff Luboya, who's an Africa-China analyst and whose research interests include the Belt and Road Initiative, the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation, and on public diplomacy. He's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, and he'll be speaking to us about China's overarching strategic interests in Africa, particularly focusing on resource governance and access. Dr. Luboya, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this very important event. I believe I was asked to contextualize the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the extraction of natural resources in the region. I haven't done much on illegal fishing in the Indian Ocean, but then I will just try and relate it to other resource extraction that happens in the continent and relate and give it a broader context. So let me just confirm if my screen is shared.
Not shared yet. No, we can still see you.
Oh, okay. You have it, right?
It's just coming up now. Yeah, we can see it.
All right. So for me, I will try and first of all introduce the Belt and Road Initiative. And I look at the Belt and Road as a global geopolitical connectivity project that basically puts China at the center of commerce along the trade routes. And here connectivity is not limited to hard infrastructure that most people are aware of, but then it encompasses issues like trade, soft infrastructure such as customs coordination, cooperation in inspections, removal of trade barriers and investments, financial cooperation on issues such as currency swaps, renminbi denominated bonds, financial regulations, etc. And it is a fully fledged long-term financial and geostrategic endeavor from the Chinese, And then coming down from the BRI aspect, we have the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, which is the sea route element of the BRI, which is more relevant to our discussion today. And the MSRI basically connects China with the rest of Asia, Africa, and Europe. And the basis for these huge investments in railways, ports, energy projects lies in this geostrategic endeavor. So looking at the BRI, it has played a key role in bringing Africa and China together and continues to drive closer ties between the two. And then through it, China has targeted a wider range of countries in Africa for infrastructure development projects and the export of goods and machinery that are creating opportunities for Chinese state-owned enterprises, you know, and these enterprises are involved in very many sectors, especially in the extractive sectors. We have high-speed rails being done, communication companies coming in, you know, and then what we are talking about today, we have distant water fishing fleets, you know. So the question is, why connectivity? You know, and for me, I look at it from the perspective that it is meant to further open up China to the outside world, as its economic model requires new markets and privileged access to resources. So connectivity for who? You're talking about trade and the need for China to access new markets and resources, you know. So critics accuse China of imperial or neocolonial and sometimes mercantilist schemes, and they argue that the initiative solely serves Chinese economic model. But then optimists retort that it is a futuristic, cooperative, and altruistic endeavor that serves the common development needs of both China and Africa, you know. But then further from that, I think generally we can say, and we can see, that it is designed to take control of strategic and critical global supply chains and reduce the flow of international to redirect the flow of international trade towards Beijing, you know. And it also represents a special fix for Chinese excess capital and capacity, you know. This means that, you know, it is the geographic expansion and development of a solution, or as a solution to capital accumulation. So China is basically exporting its excess capacity to Africa. Then looking at the Maritime Silk Road Initiative and Africa as a supplier of resources for the Chinese economy, you know, we see that China is keen to secure Africa's stockpile of national marine resources, key to its long-term economic stability and prosperity. And focus has shifted to strategic resources of the future. And you can see from the list where Africa fits in this strategic plan, you know. A third of China's oil comes from Africa. You know, half of the cobalt is in the DRC, and the rest of the minerals that are mentioned there. But then we are venturing into a new and underexplored area, especially from the perspective of the African continent. You know, the marine or the blue economy that is underexploited from the continent. It is underregulated and underreported. And this is where EJF comes in to fill the gap, you know. So looking at the extraction of marine resources, there exists bilateral agreements between Beijing and its partners in Africa. And most often these port construction and fish factory projects are accompanied by licensing agreements for access to the rich fishing grounds in the host countries surrounding their exclusive economic zones. And Beira Fishing Port in Mozambique is a good example. But then beyond these formalized agreements, we have seen evidence of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing by Chinese fishing fleets, you know. Interestingly, we also have secret infrastructure for access deals, and these have also been documented, you know. For example, a Chinese corporation invested $120 million to expand the Beira's fishing port. But then, surprisingly, the country's fishing minister was not aware of a separate agreement giving fishing rights to 100 Chinese vessels. This just gives a picture of how dire the situation is. And it speaks to the issue of weak regulation, because they generally operate in a legally gray zone, holding tons of marine resources. And related to that is also the issue of underreporting that leads to overfishing and depriving local governments of the badly needed tax revenue, as well as the livelihoods of the local fishermen in those areas. You know? So what is in it for Africa, especially when you're looking at the balance of interest between the two and considering that these agreements exist? So we have to acknowledge that Africa has benefited to some extent from Chinese economic boom through increased trade and investments. And this mostly occurs in the natural resource sectors, but at what cost? I know most of the speakers are familiar with the happenings in Mozambique, for example. And I'll just give an example just to give a picture of what is happening there. So this fishing port was destroyed by a cyclone in the year 2000. The government secured some money from the Arab Bank and the African Development Bank in 2005, you know, but this money only covered 10% of the cost of rebuilding the port. So what did the government do? They turned to the Chinese Exim Bank, and they were awarded $120 million to reconstruct the port. And you know how it works with the Chinese, you get that kind of farming and the contract is given to a Chinese firm. So the contract was awarded to China Harbour Engineering Company. And in addition to upgrading and expanding the port facility, the company built a fish processing factory and an ice plant. You know, after completion, it was handed over to the government, and the revenue generation was expected to begin to recoup some of the cost of the loan over a 20-year life period. However, this was not to be, and this was because of its inability to produce sufficient revenue and to meet outstanding interest payments that were due in the year 2022. And this happened because of several reasons. First, the loan was granted in 2014 and the port only started to operate in 2019. You know, the port itself is operating at only 30% of its full capacity due to the lack of clients. It was also expected that the port will handle 700,000 tons of produce every year, but it is only producing about 200,000 tons a year due to lack of demand, you know. And then, you know, the local processing plant virtually stands idle as Chinese vessels are still exporting their rich cut and unprocessed. And the new ice plant, which was expected to produce 60 tons a day, is producing 5 tons a day, you know. So this somehow leads to debt distress and is becoming a big challenge for the Cameroon, for the government. So I would say that it becomes clear that Chinese SOEs are operating in Africa on purely profit ventures, and it is the same case for Chinese distant fishing fleets. So they take advantage of the BRI to invest in massive infrastructure projects in the continent with state support. And it is very lucrative, but poorly regulated. And those who followed the last FOCAC meeting, this was acknowledged by Xi Jinping, where he spoke of the end of vanity projects, you know. So these deals are unbalanced. They are unfair. And then because of the weak marine governance, you know, there's also an element of corruption, and it is also fueling conflicts in some parts of Africa, you know. So apart from the fisheries and the marine issues, these are just to give you a picture of the extent to which extraction happens away from the marine, it also happens when it comes to other natural resources in the continent, and it is a challenge that happens across the continent, you know. So what has the Chinese state tried to do to intervene, you know? So China talks about a maritime community with a shared future, and it has declared that it advocates for maritime peace, joint governance of oceans, cooperation in fishing management, you know, supporting maritime technologies and information sharing mechanisms, you know. China talks about a Blue Cooperation Initiative that looks to coordination, financing, and harmonization, you know. When it comes to domestic regulation, we are aware that China passed a number of domestic laws and used policy tools such as the 5-year plan to promote and regulate the sector. And allegedly, it is transforming the policies regarding bottom trawling as well as harmful subsidies for domestic fishing, you know. So these are some of the Chinese state interventions that they are putting in place. But then how effective are they? You know, personally, I think the fact that they are responsive is a good sign, but I think more should be done, you know, especially from a collaborative perspective, so that they become more effective. And that will take a lot of effort, particularly from the African governments involved in these deals, to be, you know, to have a bigger say, a more bargaining power, and the capacity to intervene when laws are broken, and also the capacity to take action when that happens. And that will take a lot of collaborative efforts, you know. So in conclusion, I will say that at the bilateral level, China should consider extending the Green Belt and Road beyond its focus on energy and climate to include investing in sustainable ocean practices and fisheries management, you know. Access and extraction of natural and marine resources should be transparent, fair, and sustainable, you know. So they should consider creating a regional framework for constructive engagement with stakeholders to facilitate information sharing related to fisheries management, with a particular focus on operations of foreign-owned fishing vessels and companies in West Africa and some parts of East Africa. Then we should also consider developing multilateral fisheries access agreements to better balance negotiating power and streamline access to fisheries resources. And I'm glad from the previous speaker that this is happening, you know, and seems like we are, you know, we're on a positive trend. Then there's need for more vigilance on the part of African countries, you know, and this will include teamwork and collaboration. There needs to be more data sharing on fishing efforts and improved transparency to better manage fisheries, especially migratory stocks, you know. And finally, and this has been talked about, capacity building to police, protect, and safeguard our marine resources, you know. And we should not exclude China from this, because there's a lot to learn from their own experiences and capabilities in managing domestic fisheries and fish meal factories. So these are lessons that Africa can pick. And there's also need to redirect the Chinese investments into ecotourism and sustainable fisheries management, rather than the unsustainable fish meal and fish oil factories. And I think focus should shift on this, rather than just investing in fishing, especially when it comes to foreign fishing fleets. And then finally, I will say there needs to be the national, regional, and international advocacy needs to be enhanced. And I like what EJF is doing. So with more collaboration and more input, especially from African countries and the local NGO networks, then we can be able to increase the capacity when it comes to monitoring, reporting that leads to better regulation and progress when it comes to that sector. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mboya. We'll come back to you shortly with a question, but we're just going to jump now to His Excellency Pobert Mahatante, who is the Minister of Fisheries and Blue Economy in Madagascar and has been in post since 2021. But before that, was an academic associate professor at Toliara University, Madagascar, in the field of oceanography. So has a whole range of perspectives on this issue, and we're absolutely delighted to have you, Your Excellency, and understand that you're in a bit of a hurry. So I'll hand over to you immediately.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Max. Good evening, everyone. I don't know if it's the evening or the morning. I am currently in Fort Dauphin, which is in deep southern Madagascar, and I was expecting to intervene earlier, as I'm going to welcome His Excellency Mr. President in a few minutes. So maybe I don't have time anymore to go through my presentation. But if you have questions, and then I will answer directly to the questions related to Chinese fisheries in Madagascar, and maybe this is how we can do it. I have about 5 minutes, and everyone is already here, so they are waiting for me. So if you could please ask direct questions, and I'll give answers. Thank you. I will be sharing my presentation with you by email.
That's fantastic, Your Excellency, and thank you again for your time. Your country is a candidate country for the Fisheries Transparency Initiative, so you've obviously recognized the importance of transparency on this issue. Would you mind saying a bit about why Madagascar chose that path and the benefits it has on the issue of illegal fishing?
Well, as you know, we need transparency in many fields worldwide. So Madagascar chose this path, and just a few weeks after my first nomination, I emailed the Fishery Transparency Initiative team, and they positively answered to our request. So now we are among the country candidates, and we are looking forward to for the final approval. The benefit from it is, of course, as long as you work in transparency way, and then people trust you. People have their trust on you, so investors come. And also all of the actors, the civil society, private sector, even the government, they trust the minister, as it is under your leadership, to lead your department toward transparency. So as long as we are working on it now, since August 2021, we didn't record any Chinese fishing fleet in our EEZ. We didn't catch any of them, and that is probably just because they have been warned, maybe. So now they are away, and we have also the regional program for fisheries surveillance, which is under the European Union support, conducted with the rest of the other countries within the Indian Ocean too. So this is to tell you that as long as we work together with all of the neighboring countries, and also working in transparent way, answering to all of questions that journalists ask, and always convening conferences and so on and so forth, writing report. The first fisheries report that was launched end of last year, December last year, gave, let's say, a high, a consideration on Madagascar regarding the transparency on fisheries. So now I can say today that investors now come, many people now more invest in blue economy just because they trust you. They trust the system that you have. And just couple months ago, I have welcomed in my office the head of the U.S. Naval in Africa, the Admiral Calvin Foster, and also Madam Juliette Baylor, who is the head of Europe and Africa Naval Forces, U.S. Naval Forces, and all of them congratulated Madagascar because of the effort made regarding the fisheries and transparency. We are working with the rest of the countries. Maria Elulua can witness to that. She's based in Mozambique, that Madagascar ratified all of the existing regulations, global regulations to fight against IUU fishing, starting from the Cape Town Agreement, the SADC conventions, and so on and so forth. So if there are still any ratifications that Madagascar still need to do, we are ready. I am ready at any time to ratify all of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister. And on that final point, you mentioned two important treaties that you've ratified, and we look forward to hearing from Maria about the SADC aspect of that. In terms of labor issues on vessels, has Madagascar given any consideration to the ILO Convention 188, which looks at, rather than the fishery side, the people working on the fishing vessels? And is that something that you would welcome looking at, if not?
Well, of course, we are looking into ratifying the ILO Convention too. My government has approved already the department to ratify for it. And just for your information, we don't have any Chinese fishing fleets in our waters. All we have are Malagasy fleets. That are all we have. And we are open to all civil society organizations. I would like to invite the EJF to come to Madagascar someday and do some investigation too. So I would wish my country, now the president has come. That is his plane coming. So I would wish that someday he will come. But Maria, she has been to Madagascar 2 or 3 times. So she could also talk about the effort that we are conducting now in Madagascar. Thank you so much, colleagues. You can also send your questions to email. I will give answer to that. Thank you. I have to leave you as the president is now landing. Thank you. I am at the airport.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing from Maria for further insights on monitoring and surveillance in Madagascar and the region more widely. But before we get to Maria, I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Tabitha Mallory, who's the founder and CEO of the China Ocean Institute and an affiliate professor at the University of Washington. Dr. Mallory specializes in Chinese foreign and environmental policy and is currently conducting research on China and global ocean governance, with published work on China's fisheries and oceans policy. Dr. Mallory will discuss the Chinese policy context, as well as our report's recommendations on how to best respond to the Chinese distant water fleet. Dr. Mallory, thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted to hear from you.
Thank you very much. So first, I want to say congratulations to the team at EJF for an excellent report and the accompanying film. This report definitely fills gaps in our knowledge about the Chinese distant water fishing activities in the Southwest Indian Ocean, especially because it's a relatively new region for China to be operating in. But I think many people know that China's been long-term active in West Africa since the mid-1980s, but has expanded into East Africa only more recently, really in the past decade or so. So I want to commend the researchers for their work using a wide variety of sources to paint a picture of what is going on in the region, because that can be really difficult to do to gain that understanding. I essentially have 2 sets of comments. Some echo what some of the previous speakers said, which I think is great. First, I want to express some optimism, and then I'm going to return second to the usual pessimism. But I want to say, though, from the optimistic perspective, that as a community of people who care deeply about these issues, which I think is really anybody who's on this call, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we've made a lot of progress in our work addressing these issues. I know it's hard to see that sometimes. There's still so many obvious problems, but IUU fishing is taken so much more seriously now, not just by governments, but also notably by the security community. Deputy Assistant Secretary Mesfin gave some great detailed examples of this from the United States. And so this topic is no longer just the purview of environmentalists and activists. I also want to say that this is reflected as well in Chinese policy changes over the past decade. So just 10 years ago, the Chinese government was still officially stating that they had no problems at all with IUU fishing. And then they have been confronted with a ton of evidence of IUU fishing by their fleets. And they actually have responded to this by updating their fisheries law, updating their distant water fishing regulations to include the issue more directly, including language about treatment of crew, plus other policies on training compliance, removing some fishing subsidies, creating new penalties for nefarious activity, and so on. Dr. Cliff Mboya also described a lot of these initiatives. And Minister Mahantate also had acknowledged that the Chinese have been responsive, for example, to some of the warnings from the Madagascar government. So I think it's important to acknowledge these developments, not just for encouragement in our own work, but also to encourage the Chinese, because doing this really adds to their incentives to change in a constructive way. If the international community can recognize any changes in a positive direction that they're doing, instead of always just pointing out the negative things, I think that can create incentives for them, like just adding carrots to the sticks. So I think that's really important, and that's kind of about it for the optimism. I'll get back to the pessimism now. So there are still so many challenges, despite a lot of these policy changes. Implementation and enforcement are still clearly hugely inadequate. This report makes it clear that Assistant Secretary Mesfin also pointed out the say and do gap that is, obviously there. Information transparency has gotten so much worse in China in the past few years. It's a lot harder to work with Chinese counterparts because of the top-down controlling nature of the Xi regime. There are still people in China who know about what's going on with distant water fishing. It's mostly academics and those from the limited NGO community. Even some people in certain government positions know. They are critical of these activities, but they've either been silenced or are too scared nowadays to speak up. Some of you might have heard about, just a few months ago, there was this incident with this so-called Mr. Li, who was a fisheries consultant who got in trouble with the Chinese Ministry of State Security for working with foreigners. This has scared everybody in China. It's much harder to get information and data from Chinese sources nowadays because of China's issuance of laws on national security, cybersecurity, data security. So that is definitely a formidable challenge that we're going to face. So the way I see it moving forward for the foreseeable future is that we're going to have to be working to do what we can outside of China. I think it's really great to add more information through evidence-based reports like this one. I really appreciated the policy recommendations, which aim to create systems that address these problems regardless of who the actors are. So we're talking about improvements from, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, which is the RFMO in the region, to what local governments can do, flag states, issues like traceability in the seafood supply chain, the role of market countries. So I just really thought the policy recommendations were excellent, very detailed, great for fostering values of transparency and sustainability. So I think I'll just end here by saying that I encourage everyone to check those out. And then I hope that we can all work on these and build on them. So back to you.
Thank you. I'll just ask a few questions if you don't mind. What in your analysis of the Chinese approach and the reforms that they have been making, what are the biggest remaining gaps in terms of the policy gaps that they have on IUU fishing and human rights abuses at sea?
Yeah, so from, obviously aside from like the obvious, the lack of transparency, they also have not ratified the fish stocks agreement, the compliance agreement, the port states measures agreement. So those, that's really important. I would say aside from that, it's really more work needs to be done on the implementation and enforcement. China does have some legitimate challenges in terms of monitoring their fleets and in terms of capacity. Dr. Mboya also talked about this. Their fisheries bureau is actually short-staffed. And so they also need more training too for their crew members. I mean, there is really a difference between, China's not just like the unilateral actor that has everyone on the same page. I mean, there is a difference between, like what their crew members, the captains might be doing, the fishing community might be doing, who are, kind of like around the world notorious for their, just kind of Wild West behavior, I guess you could call it. But you know, there's a difference between them and, say, people who are you know, trained in some of the, you know, the best kind of monitoring and surveillance techniques and fisheries management techniques, who might be in the government or in academia. So there needs to be more training for crew, you know, in the fishing companies in terms of rules and norms. So I think it's, you know, because of these constraints on their end, I think it's important that we do make information and data from the monitoring that we outside in the international community can do, make that available so that the Chinese can also act on it. I think it can be especially effective if that information can get to the Chinese technical experts who work on fisheries management, and it's not seen as just politically motivated, because that's definitely a concern, you know, just given all the geopolitical tensions with China right now. I'll just say, like, kind of, I know you asked about China, but just like a couple more things I would add. Outside of China, I think it's really important for host countries, like the ones that are in the region in East Africa, to consider whether they really want to have distant water fishing fleets in their EEZs. I mean, most of the evidence suggests that these fleets do not fish sustainably compared to like what the local fishers do. And so anything that can be done to improve local governance and help address some of the socioeconomic needs that lead host countries to sign these foreign fisheries access agreements in the first place with foreign governments, I think that would be really helpful. And then one final point, in terms of high seas management, I think we need to you know, improve the existing RFMO processes and also expand RFMO coverage to include species that aren't currently covered, like squid, which is an issue for the Indian Ocean. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. And aside from the more fisheries policies and issues that we've talked about and drivers of the expansion of the fleet, are there sort of issues relating to soft power that are relevant and that we should be looking at when we're considering this issue in the round?
So that is a really interesting topic. There's been a lot of discussion of Chinese soft power in China. It's really different from the original conception of the term, which came from Joseph Nye, who described soft power in kind of this organic sense, this grassroots diffusion of things like cultural goods. Chinese power, on the other hand, is very top-down, very state-led. It's mostly aimed at the domestic audience. And so it's this conception of soft power has been applied to the ocean sector. So China talks about Chinese ocean soft power, ocean culture, ocean consciousness, which is like an awareness among the local population about these ocean issues. And through this, the Chinese Central Authority is essentially trying to create a narrative of China as a maritime power. So there's an important identity and status component in China's seeking to develop itself as a distant water fishing nation, as a powerful one, kind of on par with other distant water fishing nations. And China sees it as a marker of having kind of like made it as a maritime power. So this aspect is unusual. You know, it's not really present in other countries. This, you know, idea of like identity and status, you know, from this sector. Unfortunately, that top-down nature means that China has commandeered a lot of the grassroots community that genuinely cares about sustainability and marine environment. And the Central Authority ultimately tries to take a lot of credit for the improvements to the environment and acts largely in a performative way. And so given that we don't have very receptive leadership in China right now, I think it's important to keep in mind it won't be that way forever. We don't know when it'll end, but I think meanwhile, we need to carry on with the work, you know, that we've been doing outside of China. And also to keep in mind that, you know, those in China who are concerned about these issues, you know, keep them in mind, because in the future, as we move forward, we're going to have to work. Those are the people we're going to work with. And it's, you know, they'll be important to have involved in terms of finding solutions to these problems, especially once things change in China. So back to you.
Thank you so much, Tabitha, for a really interesting presentation and also response to those questions. We're absolutely delighted that you were able to join us. Thank you. I'll turn to our final speaker, Maria Valles, who the Minister from Madagascar has already highlighted is an important figure in the region in tackling IUU fishing. Maria is the coordinator at the Southern African Development Community's Regional Monitoring, Control and Surveillance Coordination Center. and she brings expertise in this topic from previous positions she held in the Mozambican government, including Director of Surveillance and Head of the Department of Cooperation. So she's going to speak about the steps her organization is taking to address IUU fishing, and I believe is going to share a presentation that she'll guide us through. Over to you, Maria. Maria, if you just turn off your mute. There we are.
Okay, so I have to share it. I got. Please, can you help me? Technology. I want to share my presentation, but
if you click there, my colleague is going to share it on your behalf, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just it should be on the screen now. So if you just let him know as you pass through the slides, he'll keep pressing next. So please, whenever you're ready, please commence. Maria, can you hear us? We've got your slides loaded, so whenever you're ready to start.
No, I'm ready to start.
Oh, fantastic.
I was thinking if it's me who is sharing or is you.
We've got the slides loaded, so if you just speak through them, we'll click through them one by one.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the US government and EJF for the invitation to talk in this webinar. The issue of the labor abuse has become a priority issue in the last decade. The Southern Africa Development Community is also deeply concerned about this and is addressing the issue through several approaches. But firstly, let me quickly show you the countries we are talking about. SADC is a regional economic community comprising 60 member states. As you can see for the flags. Please move on. The SADC Fisheries Monitoring Control and Surveillance Coordination Center is a regional organization established in 2023 through the charter by member states of the SADC. The headquarters of MCSCC is in Maputo, Mozambique. MCSCC has a mandate and coordinating measure to improve fisheries MCS to combat illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in the SADC region. Human abuse on board fishing vessel is a serious violation and an indicator of IUU fishing, both issues of concern among SADC member states. This is reflected in a recent SADC policy brief, Safe and Decent Working Conditions in SADC Fisheries. Please, next slide. In the last few years, we have seen an increase in Africa, crew being abused on board fishing vessels. We have reports related to this from Namibia, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Senegal, and Ghana. But I'm sure the problem is affecting many other countries. This is a worrying trend, and there is a need to act together. Please, next slide. How do SADC and SADC MCSCC address human abuse on board fishing vessels? Awareness. This is done through policy advice, meetings, and workshops where the issue is raised and discussed. Many events with representation from ILO has been conducted and a dedicated policy brief has been developed. Please, next slide. And this is a recent case study from Namibia that involved labor abuse. As you can see, SADC MCSTC promotes awareness and lessons learning. Please, next slide. Risk assessment. One element in this risk assessment matrix used and promoted by the SADC MCS considers labor conditions on board the fishing vessel. Medium or high risk will trigger an alert to the competent authority in a member state requesting participation from that authority during the inspection of the vessel. This is work in progress, and some countries have progressed further than others. But this is a process given high priority over the coming years. I would like to note that labor conditions is not under the mandate of any Ministry of Fisheries in the region, underlining the need for or the need to develop strong interagency cooperation. This is also a priority, and the MCSCC is promoting the ratification and implementation of the three treaties, FAO PSMA, ILO C-188, and IMO Cape Town Agreement. Please, next slide. I'm not going into details, but the risk assessment looks at 5 different areas apart from reason to reject port access, license, or flag. This also includes vessels owners, vessel operations, flag state, and earlier port states used. An explanation and examples are provided to support the staff conducting the risk assessment. More than 106 risk assessments have been conducted in the last 15 months. Please, next slide. Vessel inspection. Following the mentioned risk assessment, any high-risk vessel will be inspected. This is important to check any identified potential violations. If labor, safety, or other violations are detected, an interagency approach is promoted to deal with the respective offenses. Again, this is part of the risk assessment inspection process we are promoting. The concept also includes capacity building. More than 300 inspectors and staff from other agencies have been trained so far, thanks to financial support from the government, from the US government. We are very grateful for this. We need the project to be extended. regional register of fishing vessels. The SADC minister have decided to implement a regional register of fishing vessels. Good. Standing in this register will be required to apply for a license in a number of states. The criteria for being on the register is under development and discussion. This register offers another opportunity to reduce the crew abuse on board fishing vessels. Finally, let me quote the SADC policy brief. SADC has committed to work towards safe and decent working conditions within fishery sectors of the SADC and on all SADC flagged fishing vessels and for all SADC citizens, wherever they work in the world. This is an important commitment, and the hope is that number will add this issue to their agenda to put spotlight and all the people lost or injured in the sector. The SADC commitment also contribute to achievement of the development aspiration, including sustainable development goal, the growth of blue economy, and the strengthening of human rights. Thank you so much. This is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring work, and a few speakers have noted on the importance of regional cooperation. So it's great to see that being lived in the work that you're doing, Maria. In your view, the importance of regional cooperation and information sharing, how can that sort of be transformational in tackling IUU fishing? Why is it so important?
Okay. To me, the regional cooperation is the key to address any violations related to fishing vessels, particularly when it comes to foreign vessels. This is what the SADC MCSCC is all about. It's our focus. We are doing that. We have seen again and again that a fishing vessel commits an offense and changes area operations to avoid penalties or persecutions. This used to be easy, but with regional cooperation ports can be closed and access denied. In serious case, the vessel can be arrested if the legal provisions are in place. I would also like to refer to what I earlier said about the three treaties. Together, they make ports control and port state major stronger. We can do it. Due to different mandates of different authorities, this is crucial for us to be effective in the fight against IUU fishing and related to crimes. We must also remember that the safety or labor violation represents a risk of IUU fishing and vice versa. So, yes, we need regional cooperation to address the problem, but we also need interagencies cooperation on a national level. Both takes time to develop. Both can help countries to protect our resources. to build our future, to build our resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Yeah, it's an absolute delight hearing from you. We all look forward to seeing your center as it progresses and takes on these important challenges. We're running up to against the time. We had hoped to take more questions from the audience, but running out of time. However, a couple of questions have come through, and we're going to signpost people to the speakers that they relate to. And if you haven't had a chance to send a question, you can just reply to the email that you got the invite or the event confirmation from with any questions that you have, and we can make sure those are answered. I do have time to answer one question, just using host prerogative, that I received asking about how obviously this report focuses on one region, but how can we get a better view of the impact of Chinese activity in terms of IUU fishing and other environmental crimes across the world. I'm just sharing on the screen a few other EJF reports that we've done that relate to other regions. In the case of West Africa, the two reports on the right, one relates to Ghana and the other relates to West Africa and looks at the issue of distant water vessels using local flags and hiding themselves as vessels with flags from coastal African states. And then the two reports on the left are global in scope. One, the ever-widening net, is a global review of the Chinese distant water fleet. And in the bottom left, murky waters is our review of Chinese legislation and regulation, and looks at sort of the particular issues around transparency, which Tabitha spoke about, and provides recommendations about how those can be resolved. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's obviously been a lot of reporting recently as well, such as from Ian Urbina, looking at not just China's activities in individual regions, but across the world, and encourage people who haven't already looked at outlaw oceans to also look at that. But we are now at the end of our scheduled time, so I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. Once again, encourage anyone with questions to get in contact. We'd love to stay in touch with everyone and connect people to any of the speakers that they'd like to be connected to. And wish everyone a pleasant day. Thank you.